Sam Fresquez is an interdisciplinary artist based in Phoenix, Arizona. Her work documents experiences of authority, gender, and group dynamics. Fresquez oftentimes uses gendered objects such as hair, jewelry, and protective gear, along with gendered spaces such as Home Depot, body shops, and NASCAR races. She uses sculpture and performance to investigate how and why information is passed from one generation to the next. Fresquez graduated with her BA from the Arizona State University in 2019 and has exhibited nationally and internationally. All right, Sam, take it away.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I guess before anything else, I just wanted to say thank you, Mariana, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And thanks everyone at the Tucson Museum of Art for having us. I'm really honored to be a part of the Biennial this year. And I also wanted to say thank you to Maite Amble, who is the dancer who danced in my project, and then Jake Hines, who's the photographer who shot the video. They're both really talented, amazing people. But yeah, so today I'll be talking about my piece in the Biennial that's titled Spicy Latina Shakes Ass. And I'll talk about the process or the thought process behind the project, as well as show you other artists' work that have sort of influenced how I've been thinking about this work, and also how this project sort of fits into my larger body of work. So yeah, so next slide. Okay, so Spicy Latina Shakes Ass really stems from my interest in how porn is oftentimes categorized by race, both by race and by action, which I think is really telling in a lot of ways. I started thinking a lot about the Latina section and sort of the tropes and the stereotypes that go along with that. And I feel like the most common that I saw was spicy. And so I was thinking about sort of how and why that stereotype came to be. And I was thinking a lot about what actions connect spice to sex. And really there are a few, right? There's sweating, squirting. Recently someone brought up the endorphins, a rush of endorphins. And I thought that was really interesting that like when someone is pregnant, in order to induce pregnancy, it's suggested that you either eat spicy food or have sex, because that rush of endorphins sort of like sparks movement in your body, which I think is really interesting. And then also shaking as a connection between the two. And so shaking is sort of, that connection is how I got to this idea of, you can go to the next slide. That's sort of how I got to this idea of building these belts that would shake out spices when you twerk with them on. And so as you can see, the one on the left is slightly different from the one on the right, which is the one that ended up being in the video that's in the Biennial. And then in these photos, they're kind of different from the Biennial video as far as I ended up using a yellow backdrop because I really wanted to visually reference Pornhub, and yeah, I really thought that this was like a playful way to recontextualize the stereotype. And you can go to the next slide. So a project that I thought a lot about before making this piece was this project called Chocolate by the artist Corinne Victoria Smith. And you can see this project that's on a website specifically for it called seekingchocolate.com. And so the way it works is that there's this grid that is made of these sort of like chocolate figurines, and then you click on one of the chocolates, and there's a pop-up that comes up that's an ad that was, it's a Craigslist ad that is seeking chocolate women and sort of referring to Black women as being as chocolate. And I don't know, I think that there's something really interesting in both of those terms, chocolate and spicy, that when people use them, they really think of them as a compliment, or they think of them as, I don't know, I think a lot of times they think of them as being a good thing. But when you really like look at a project like this, I think it's more clear that to compare someone to a food, and to compare someone to something that you're consuming really like crosses a line of fetishization. And I really wanted to play more with that in my work. So yeah, next slide. So since making this work, I've also been really interested in artists like Alan Wexler. He is a sculptor he's an artist who kind of bridges sculpture and performance in a way that I think is really interesting. You can go to the next slide. So yeah, these are all projects by him, and they're really interesting because they're objects that sort of need to be worn or used in a way so that they're like activated. And I was really interested in the way that he just talks about the world. Yeah, okay, next slide. Another artist that I'm really interested in and have been thinking a lot about is Silla Bermudez, Silverman. She has made these replicas of her childhood dollhouse that are cast in sugar. You can go to the next slide. And I've never heard her speak about this project specifically, but I think that when you're using food, that there's so much of a historical context to food and how it's traveled throughout the world and the role that it's played in so many people's lives, like sugar and like spices. So yeah, next slide. Something else that I thought a lot about while I was working on this project is exactly how and why spices exist. Like, why do spices exist in nature was a question that I had. And it's really interesting because spices are, plants make spices to protect themselves from bacteria and from fungi. And so that is also the reason why around the equator, spices are more common and just exist in the natural environment more there, because they have to deal with heat and with preservation in a really different way. So if you think about it, like plants in places where it snows don't need to protect themselves in the same way. And it's also why cooking and like cuisine in colder places is different, is because if you're living in the snow and you have meat, you can just put it out outside and it'll freeze. But if you're living somewhere that's hot all year round, then you have to preserve your food in a way that's different. And I mean pre refrigerators. And so that's why food in India is so different from food in Britain. And I really think that that's interesting. I also really related to the idea of spice as preservation, because the only times that I've been called spicy weren't necessarily in like a sexual context, but more so in moments of conflict. And so yeah, I was really interested in the science of it all. Next slide. So as far as how this piece relates to my larger body of work, the main questions that I ask in my work are, where did this come from, and how did this get here? And not necessarily for everything that I make, but just for a lot of the work that I make, those are things that I'm thinking about. Which oftentimes means looking at the historical context of an object, of an area, of a system, or in this case, of a stereotype. And so another example of this sort of questioning in my work is this project called Cielito Lindo. I was thinking a lot about mariachi attire and like the history of the charro outfit. And the charro outfit can be traced back to when the Spanish colonized what is now Mexico. Indigenous Mexicans weren't allowed to ride horses. And then when they finally were, the Spanish made them dress in a way so that they could be differentiated from afar. So that's where this, like, the mariachi outfit comes from. So like the wide sombrero was originally meant to protect people from the sun, and the buttons on the side of the pants were originally meant to keep your pants tight when you are riding, so that you wouldn't like get snagged in a bush or something. And even the etymology of the word is really interesting. Like charro originally meant person who stops, person who speaks roughly, person of the land, person with bad taste. And just the way that the clothing, but also how the clothing has been thought of has so drastically changed. It's like now an emblem of Mexican identity. And I think that by looking at the buttons more closely, that I'm hoping to, I guess, sort of point to this history of colonialism that's so deeply rooted in Mexican culture itself, and I think is really easily glazed over a lot of the time. Yeah, so next slide. And so a lot of my text-based work is also answering those same questions. For a long time, I was really interested in language and how it was passed down from generation to generation, specifically thinking about a history of Spanish in the United States education system. For a long time, it was illegal to speak Spanish in Arizona schools, and that led to generations of Latinx people being unable to speak the language. And so a lot of my text-based work involved interviewing people who either did or didn't speak the language of their parents, transcribing those interviews, and then sort of building objects from those transcriptions. Next slide. And this project was called El Nuevo Coloso. It was a piece that I did for the Phoenix Art Museum in 2018 or 19, where I had 3 different members of my family translate the same passage from English into Spanish. The backmost passage is my grandma, the middle is my dad, and the front is my brother. And I was really interested to see not only how the text changed from person to person, just because of who they are as people, but also because of how their relationship to the language differed from generation to generation. So yeah, I believe that is my last slide. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for sharing